Road to Nova. Par One. Produced by Pacificatories.
Chapter 1. Sam and Nova in the remedial English class. Jake sat right behind her in the remedial English class. The seats weren't assigned per se, but students ended up seating where they had sat on the first day of class. The classroom probably was just big enough to house about 20 students. It was a typical rectangular classroom in shape, but with 4 round windows that mimicked the shapes of the windows of a cruise ship. The high school sat on the top of a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Jake was usually among the first group of sophomores who came in and sat themselves down a few minutes before 11 a.m. The classroom was studded with a dozen of the student desks that, Jake reckoned, were purposefully designed to be most uncomfortable. Jake always sat on the seat on the 4th row to the left against the wall with the porthole windows. Jake acted as though he was thumbing through the textbook while slyly looking to the left-hand corner in the front, where the entrance door was. Alas, there she was, coming through the door. Swaying her straight flaxen blonde hair that came down to her hips, she clanked the high-heel boots down to the seat in front of Jake. Jake desperately tried to ignore her as she swung her long hair, slapping gently against the plastic back support of the student desk. But, just before she plopped herself down, Jake jutted up his head, in a smooth natural motion, catching her eyes for a millisecond. Jake said,
"Hey Nova,"
in a voice about a half-octave down from his natural tone. Without looking, she blurted out,
"Hi, Jake."
Just about when the long arm of the clock hanging above the chalkboard inched up to the 12, Mrs. Johnson walked in and quickly hurtled into her cushy leather armchair behind her desk located further in the corner of the classroom. Mrs. Johnson then flipped open the binder on a page where a small post-it had been tagged. She said,
"You? They're on the first row. Please read from where we left off yesterday. Now let's see. Page 24, paragraph 3.
The class was used to the drill. That is, reading aloud the assigned short stories by paragraph. The book given to us was called Compendium of Great American Short Stories. For this week, we were on A Miss Found in a Bottle by Edgar Allan Poe. There was this kid with ginger hair, unintentionally forced to sit on the first row to the left, closest to the door. Scott Happison was his name, an average-looking kid, not a ginger like a hardcore ginger, but with a pale skin, of the average build, not too geeky nor jokey. Nonetheless, he read well, crisply enunciating every polysyllabic word, but in a monotonic rhythm, as if reading a yellow book. Once one paragraph was completed, there was an awkward silence. The usual drill would have been as follows: a student sitting on the next row down would pick up where the previous student had left off. But, today, Sam Pereski, the supposedly next student in turn, was dozing off, oblivious of the natural rhythmic flow of the class. He was about a few inches on the shorter side for a sophomore. Due to this physique, he would probably have been relentlessly picked on by the sociopathic jocks, but for his Mediterranean natural good looks with a chiseled jaw and overly testosteronized buffed body. In addition, he was a captain of the school varsity wrestling team. No one fucked with him. In fact, he harnessed an air of awe and respect among his peers. He always wore a worn-out letterman jacket with a big stylized letter, R, sewn onto the left breast. Most kids could not have distinguished between the Trumpian pro wrestling from the Olympian Greco-Roman wrestling, and to the few who had seen it probably considered it pretty fagly with all that touching by the wrestlers who wore the likes of the 50s swimsuits. But the letter R communicated the air of awesomeness, even to those who knew nothing about the sports. Anyway, his father owned a liquor store on the other side of the track, which formed an informal border between the ever-encroaching Chalice and the traditionally Greek neighborhood. Sam worked his ass off at the store, day and night. He had a brother, dubiously graduated about 3 years earlier and had the same Greco-Roman look but with a slightly larger and taller build. Sam, his dad and his older brother, with a handful of part-time cholas, ran the place, from 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. Sam was pretty much absent from school, physically and mentally. Except for the wrestling practices, he did the absolute minimum to just barely pass the bar for graduation. Jake went to the same junior high with Sam. Jake knew Sam just enough to say something like, "Hey, dude," when there was a run-in. After a minute or so of deafening silence, the whole class dearly hoping that Sam would wake up, Mrs. Johnson just said in a flat tone,
"Next."
Without skipping a beat, Nova Chomsky, whose seat is behind Sam's, jumped in and started reading the next paragraph. While Nova's voice sounded like lyrical music to Jake's ears, she did have difficulties reading long polysyllabic words, Latin or Greek in origin, the kinds of words that might show up on the SAT and never be seen again. Not that Jake was studying for the SAT in particular, he was just more or less versed in obscure English words with their origins in Romance language on account of spending so much time with his French grandmother in his formidable years. As Nova read on for some time, she came up on one of those words of romance in nature and hesitated a bit, ever so slightly. Almost prescient of the situation, Jake whispered,
"Incomprehensible,"
in an esoteric lower tone that seemingly could be heard only by her. Immediately thereafter, Nova enunciated,
"Incomprehensible,"
with a little bit of French accent and quickly moved on to the next sentence. No one seemed to be aware of this minuscule transaction between the two students. The fact of the matter was that Jake shadowed read silently, along with Nova. In the beginning, when Nova had tripped over a needlessly long-winded word, Jake had helped out, almost instinctively, at first noticeable to the students around them, but with some practices in the natural course of things, the soft whispering became an art of sort, with a confidential and dedicated bandwidth between Nova and Jake. When Nova finished off her allotment of paragraph, Jake swiftly picked it up and adroitly passed onto the kid behind him. Mrs. Johnson, flipping through the latest edition of Vogue from the school library, let this routine run for a few rounds, in the natural course of things, until the bell rang. In a cold, mechanical tone, Mrs. Johnson said,
"Class, please read the next short story in the book for homework,"
without even bothering to check the title, and she quickly left the room. Following suit, Nova swiftly left the room, so quickly in fact that it seemed as though her long blonde hair were fluttering in the air to catch up to her. The guys in the room were gawking at her for that fleeting moments, trying to observe every inch of her curves.
En route to Nova. Parwan. Thank you for your viewership. Produced by Pacificatoris.